So welcome, my colleagues and students. So thank you for joining us at Brian Sukhai's dissertation proposal defense. My name is Daphne Wang, Associate Professor of Finance. It was my honor to co-chair this dissertation with Dr. Robert Omas, Professor of Accounting. We are happy to have Dr. Robert Borland, our department chair and Professor of Accounting, to serve as committee member together with Dr. Tom No, our external members. So Dr. No is a professor of finance at East Carolina University. She has been a certified CFA since 2015 and certified financial planner since 2019. In past 15 years, she published more than 85 articles in finance, accounting, and business, many of which are top 8 or Supreme 8 journals, such as Journal of Banking Finance, Journal of Corporate Finance, Journal of Empirical Finance, and so on. So she and her co-author present paper at the top accounting and finance annual conferences like AAA and FMA many times, maybe more than 30 times. I lost count, too many to count. She is also the associate editor for Applied Economics. And the last and the most important, she was my professor and the PhD dissertation chair when I was at UT. I'm so grateful to have all of them to serve on the committee. Thank you. So Brian Sukhai is one of the DBA 6 students who took the finance courses with me last fall, but we never met each other in person because he lives in Guyana, another country. He has 20 years of professional and executive experience in commercial banking and the utility industry. So he's also a CPA. This dissertation proposal was extended from his semester paper at Dr. Omas accounting DBA class. The topic is related to corruption impact on the firm value, specifically after the passenger of FCPA Act of 1977. So Brian added 2 more research questions regarding to the impact from the liquidity and the earning management, and the complete data collection in the summer. So the defense is scheduled to finish in 1 hour by 10. I will give Brian 25 to 30 minutes to present his proposal. Please mute your microphone and do not interrupt him during his presentation. So hold your question and check comment. After his presentation, the committee member will ask questions first, so Brian can defend his proposal. If we have time left, we will open the floor to all the faculty and students. If we run out of time, please send your question or comment to Brian and me. Thank you for your patience and cooperation. Without further delay, Brian, please take the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. Good morning, all. Before I commence, I think it would be remiss of me not to start by thanking my committee. Ever since just after comps, this occurred just the starting of May 2021. We've started to have a look at this paper. So had it not been for the input of the committee, I don't believe I would have been sitting here in Georgetown, Guyana on the 17th of September to make this presentation to you. Allow me also to extend sincere gratitude to Dr. Wang. Like I said just now, we started this process way back in May. I don't believe we've missed any of our fortnightly meetings since then. So if my arithmetic is correct, I think we might have met just about 8 or 9 times working on this dissertation proposal, right? So thanks again. I remain eternally grateful. And like I said, had it not been for your input, had it not been for your guidance, had it not been for your hand-holding in some aspects, I don't think I would have come to this point. Right, so what have I got? Participation in corruption deals, impact on firm value, corporate liquidity, and earnings management. Before I break out into the main slides, just allow me to tell you a story, just to provide the motivation for me wanting to write on this particular area. Prior to me holding the current office that I hold, I worked for 10 years, just about 10 years, 9.5, at the delegation of the European Union to Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname. And it was during that tenure that I really started to have, I started to become familiar with the corruption literature, because quite a number of the multilateral bodies, the EU included, the World Bank, the United Nations, it's a big thing for them, because if you're going to disseminate aid, especially to developing countries, emerging countries, and Guyana is classified as one of those, you're going to have stringent anti-corruption guidelines enshrined within the documents that provide a legal basis for those development cooperation. So it was around that time, just about like I said, 9.5 years ago, that I really started to have an appreciation for this whole construct of corruption, and it kind of like spawned an interest in me. Outside of becoming familiar with the literature, mainly white papers coming out of the EU, I also developed, I would say, a great degree of appreciation for the disproportionate impact it has on poor people, right? Not so fortunate people, for people who are living in the hinterlands, the rural areas, right? So it was around that time again that I said, look, given that this is such a big thing, I really want to contribute to being part of the solution. So here am I. I'm writing a paper on corruption, and I hope that over the next, Dr. Wang said 25 minutes to half an hour, I would be able to sufficiently inform you on what I would be writing on. All right, so let me just share my slides. Can you see the slides? Just can you confirm for me, please?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. Right, so my agenda, more or less, I have 10 points. I'll start with the definition. I'll talk a bit about the FCPA. I'll tell you what that means in a minute. I'll talk you through my literature review. I'll brief you on my research questions, my hypotheses, my models. We'll talk a bit about the sample, the data. We'll talk about the variables that we're using for this particular paper. And also, we've already identified additional analyses that need to be included to more or less buttress the paper that bit much more to ensure it holds water. We'll talk a bit about the contributions and implications. We already have some descriptive statistics. Once time permits, I will walk you through those. And then we will be breaking out for Q&A. Right, so what really is corruption, right? So there are quite a number of definitions out there, right? So for the purposes of this paper, I thought I'd highlight three. World Bank, I spoke about the multilateral bodies having an interest in this type of thing. So in 2016, it's a very simple definition. It's one I like a lot, the abuse of public office for personal gain. I think this is very applicable. Transparency International, they have defined it as behavior on the part of officials in the public sector in which they improperly and unlawfully enrich themselves by misuse of the public power entrusted to them. And I've got to say that Transparency, I think everybody knows who the World Bank is, but Transparency International, they are a watchdog agency. They're headquartered in Berlin, and their mandate basically speaks to anti-corruption. So they focus a lot on anti-corruption advocacy. All right, so they're one of the bigger names. So this is a definition coming out of them in 2016. And Broinbeck in 1997, if I remember this paper well, and I should, this was published in the Journal of Social Change, if I remember well. And the definition advocated by this writer, corruption is the misuse of authority as a result of considerations for personal gain. So, at this point, I've got to say that, corruption, it really has a supply side and a demand side. Right, so the demand side is more or less driven by the persons, for the context of this paper, for the public officials who are holding offices, right? So these are the people who sit on evaluation committees. These are the people who head various government agencies that are in positions of power and can actually, advocate for particular companies to get contracts or not to get contracts, right? So those are the guys who are driving the demand side. It also has a supply side. So again, for the purposes of this paper, the supply side is driven by the recalcitrant firm managers who, because they want to obtain business and in some cases retain business, they advocate, they advance bribes, right, to these public officials. So, with a view towards them perhaps, looking in the other direction, Perhaps not, ensuring that, the most technically compliant offer wins a particular contract award procedure, right? So, and in addition to that, in addition to the supply and demand side, I think it's important for me to also mention that, there are various forms of corruption. There's grand corruption, there's petty corruption. I think it's important that I make that distinction at this point in time. When we're talking about petty corruption, essentially we're talking about, greasing bribes. So I can give the example, like I did in an earlier presentation, about, what happens sometimes in my country, right? And I rather suspect it might happen in other jurisdictions as well. Let's say you have a very simplistic, or what should be a simplistic transaction in terms of renewing a particular document, maybe a business registration. What can happen is that, your renewal application can be advanced very quickly through the bureaucracy if you advance a bribe, to the person who has to sign your document giving you the approval. Or if you don't, right, chances are, the officials can become, very lead-footed, and your application sits at the bottom of a very large pile, and you basically, you wait for a very long period of time, and your processing period becomes very protracted, right? So that's a greasing bribe. Anyone can do that. The bribes that we're really talking about in this paper are rent-seeking bribes. What are those? So these are much larger, and this is often referred to or can be classified as part of, grand corruption. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about large sums of money which can be advanced again by these firm managers, maybe the CEO, maybe the CFO, maybe the COO, maybe all three of them. They collude and they say, okay, look, we want to win this contract. We've had a look at the market. We don't think we're best placed to win if we go, via transparent procedure. So we make an advance to the contracting authority that is, in the jurisdiction that they're looking to tender. And, the gentlemen, the people look the other direction, and you end up getting the contract, right? So that's an example of a rent-seeking bribe. All right, so with this slide, what I'm looking to do is just to give you a holistic picture in terms of how widespread corruption is. And this, again, is sourced from Transparency International, right? So you can see here that it starts, if you look at the legend at the bottom, you can see that it starts from highly corrupt on the left, and you're moving towards very clean states, right? You will see that very few states are actually this shade. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the shade of yellow that I have my cursor on, right? So corruption is widespread. Indiana, where I live, the CPI index is just about 40. I've got to say that we've improved significantly over the years. I think there's a lot of political will going forward, and I rather suspect that there might be subsequent improvements. But just to give you an idea, and I also should mention to you, there's a statistic coming out of the United Nations which speaks to the amount of money that is lost with respect to corruption on an annual basis. The UN in 2018, they said, based on their estimates, that approximately 5% of global GDP is lost due to corruption. Now, 5% of global GDP is, you're not talking peanuts here. That is a significant sum. It's probably very close to $4 billion, right? So this is a big problem, right? It's a huge problem, right? So I just wanted to highlight the perpetuation of corruption using that slide. So as a result of this problem being as big as it actually is, what has occurred? What have states done? Well, some states, they've advocated that legislation be enacted. And here's where the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977 comes into play, right? What exactly is this piece of legislation? So this was enacted in 1977 under the Jimmy Carter presidency. And essentially, the push behind this piece of legislation was to ensure that companies in the US, publicly traded companies, or companies that have a presence in the US, right, if they're trying to solicit business overseas, and if in their interactions with public officials, I need to make that clear. So this does not speak to a private company going to private company in the US going to a private company in, let's say, country X. It speaks to a private traded company in the US going to a public company. So you're talking private company going to a company that is actually governed by public officials, right? So this with the FCPA, what they're trying to do, right, with this piece of legislation is to curtail the advancement of public sector corruption, right? So The UK also has an equivalent, even though theirs was passed a bit later, was substantially later. Their UK Bribery Act came into effect in 2010, right? So in addition to precluding the advancement of bribes, which is probably the main thing that the FCPA was set up to do, it also has a reporting, some reporting obligations, or it brings some reporting obligations on companies, right? So the principal motivation is to prevent the advancement of bribery by U.S. citizens and public firms to public officials in jurisdictions outside of the U.S., right? And I spoke about the rationale. These companies are endeavoring to solicit, and in some cases, retain business, right? So again, the FCPA was enacted to curtail the perpetuation of public sector corruption and aid in the restoration of public sentiment in free markets, right? So that really was the push, right? And still is the push, behind this piece of legislation, right? So in principle, and I'll show you on a later slide, we have a lot of countries across the world, right, that have, they're traded in the US. You have countries drawn from all the continents who have been fined under this particular piece of legislation, right? So it can be applied across the world. And on its remitter, very few persons are actually excused. So you're talking about companies, you're talking about directors, managers, employees, and shareholders. The reach is so far that even third-party agents, including external consultants and business partners, are not excluded from the wide arm of the FCPA. I spoke a bit earlier in the earlier slide about the reporting requirements, right? So they are reporting requirements of the FCPA, and these include the necessity of firms to maintain with veracity accounting books and to have and enforce robust internal controls, right? So this is outside of the firms can also be fined if it's if it can be proven that their internal control procedures are not as robust as they ought to be to prevent the advancement of bribes. So moreover, the FCPA places emphasis on management via their oversight of the overall operations to give assurance that the transactions as recorded in the books are adequately authorized and sufficiently capture the truth and also the fairness of the accounts, right? So there is definitely a reporting obligation as well under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So I just want to break out and tell you a bit about the literature that I perused in preparation for this particular paper. Right. So I spoke a bit earlier about the different forms of corruption. I spoke a bit about the supply side of corruption, the demand side. So there are various schools of thought with respect to how corruption is perceived, right? Especially in academia, right? So corruption is a hindrance to economic growth, and that is really coming from the Sanding the Wheels school. And you have some very prominent authors there. You have Rose Ackerman, who is coming out of Yale. She has written a lot of papers on anti-corruption matters. But there's also, like I said just now, there's an alternative view where there appears to be some dissension in the ranks actually with respect to whether corruption is a good thing or a bad thing, right? So some people say that it sands the wheel, it's a hindrance to development. It results in monies being diverted away, to the pockets of the corrupt elite, as opposed to monies being committed towards getting more roads, more schools, and that type of thing, right? So there is the alternative view, like I said. So and that view is that it can actually favor economic growth, and this is referred to as greasing the wheels, right? And these two authors that I've quoted here, there are lots of others, but these two authors actually are from that school of thought. So the payment of bribes to circumvent the impediments imposed by an ineffectual and otherwise obstructive bureaucracy, right? So one of the things I learned when I was reading the literature about corruption is that one of the antecedents that most writers have actually identified is an obstructive bureaucracy. You have a lot of, as we say in Guyanese parlance, red tape. So you have to basically jump through hoops to get what should be some very ordinary and very simple transactions sorted out. So as a result of that, it creates an environment or an enabling environment for corruption to be perpetuated. Right, so I thought I'd also mention here, even though this may be a bit displaced in terms of political review, but I thought it might be useful for me to mention the position of this paper is that public sector corruption is fundamentally bad, especially given its disproportionate impact on poor citizens of states and the morally inept psychological factors which we believe underpin its execution. Right, so continuing with the literature review, and I spoke just now about the antecedents, and I spoke about the highly bureaucratic environments, onerous economic structures, weak legal systems. Maybe you have, pieces of legislation on the ground, right? And some countries have this. You can have many pieces of legislation enacted, anti-corruption legislation. But if you're not going to have the capacity and the will to enforce it, then that's another ball game, right? So corporations engage in corrupt practices for three main reasons. So why do they do this? To maintain higher prices, to maintain a market for outdated products, and to remain in the field of competition, especially if additional sales can be secured at a later date, right? And also, I think it's useful that I mentioned that corporations operate according to the logics of competition and private profit, right? So, in many ways, most companies, they're still driven. So there are many stakeholders now that have an interest in how the companies run, right? But there's still evidence that seems to suggest, or suggests rather, that this motivation to garner profits still sometimes is the primary goal, and that sometimes supersedes the achievement of the other objectives, or the will to want to achieve the other objectives, right? So sometimes that pushes firm managers, to do things more or less which chances are they might not have done, all with a view towards meeting certain targets, meeting certain numbers, right? So that in a way is also an antecedent to the perpetuation of corruption, right? So coming out of that, I also reviewed the literature that pertained to financial misconduct, right? And there are quite a number of papers that I have up on the slide, right? And all of these papers, basically, they review the impact on firm valuation, right? In terms of various corporate misdeeds, right? And they actually found that perpetuation of corporate misdeeds, they actually have a negative impact on firm value, right? So in concert with the works I've just mentioned, right? Research question one more or less was created. So with that, what I'm looking to do is, and I'm reading what it is, what is the effect of financial sanctions from an FCPA violation on firm value of the entity sampled, right? So I spoke a bit about the FCPA earlier, and I spoke about what the obligations are. So companies that are fined under the FCPA and for violative conduct, right? I want to investigate the impact that it's going to have on the firm value, right? So coming out of that, the hypothesis one emerges. There's a negative impact on firm value from an FCPA financial penalty on sample firms. To test this prediction, we've come up with this regression equation. So we're looking at firm value for a company I, year T+1, T+1 being the year after the event being the year that the enforcement action was actually rolled out, constant plus sample. Sample here will be, I'll tell you what the proxies are for firm value in a later slide. Sample here will be illustrated via a dummy variable. So if a company has been fined under the FCPA, or if there's an enforcement action, that will be 1. The other companies in the sample, they will be 0. And I have some other controls as well, which I will talk about in another slide. All right, so that's the first model that we're looking at. Via research question 2, we're introducing this concept of liquidity. So what do we mean by that? We want to find out, if a firm actually is fined, and these amounts, as I will show you in another slide, sometimes they're substantial. So again, you're not talking peanuts here, right? We want to investigate what is the impact of liquidity and firm value for the sample firms. Does the financial settlement of the fines for FCPA violations impact the liquidity? The relationship, I beg your pardon, between liquidity and firm value of the sample firms. So first hypothesis, there is a positive relationship between firm value and corporate liquidity, and I've quoted literature that I perused in the first and second lines, which supports that there is a positive relationship between firm value and corporate liquidity. So to test this prediction, I hope you can see this, it's a bit tiny on my screen, but we're reversing firm value. Company I, T+1, again, constant. We're looking at liquidity, and I'll tell you what the proxies are for liquidity in a minute. And we're also looking at several controls, which I will show you in another slide. With hypothesis 2B, we're looking at a negative relationship between corporate liquidity and sample firms. The thinking again here is that, if you will have to fork out these substantial sums. So there are really three maybe I should say this, there are really three different cash flows associated with this entire thing. There may be more, but within the context that we're speaking. So, you're looking to solicit a contract, obtain a contract, retain whatever the case is. So you advance the bribe, that's a cash outflow. Then, hopefully that results in, you getting some additional sales, some additional revenue. So that will impact your cash. And then, if you're found out, then you go through these set of procedures that are mandated under the FCPA, and then you're likely to have a cash outflow, a substantial cash outflow, which is going to be in the form of the fine. So it's bribe, hopefully an advancement or augmentation in sales, followed by a fine, which is going to be an outflow. Right. So what we're looking to do here, more or less, is to test the impact that the third cash flow has, right, on the liquidity. Right, and we're also looking via hypothesis 2C, the payment of financial penalties for FCPA enforcement actions will diminish the positive relationship between firm value and liquidity. So with this particular model, we're looking at the impact that the sample will have on the positive relationship between firm value and liquidity, and we're also including the interaction term, which is sample times liquidity. In addition to that, we're also including the controls. And like I said earlier, I'll tell you what the controls are in a minute. With research question 3, we're introducing this concept of earnings management, right? So with earnings management, essentially what companies generally look to do is to more or less, present themselves in better light. Sometimes worse, but more often than not, you're trying to show a better picture with respect to, how your financial performance is. You're trying to portray yourself in better financial health than you actually are. Right, so in Ghana, in Ghanese parlance, we refer to this as cooking the books, being creative with the accounting, fudging the numbers, right? So with this particular research question, and I'll tell you a bit about the literature in a minute. What we're looking to do is the question is research question 3. There's an enforcement action, and they start thinking, look, maybe that will result in us having to pay. There are a couple of fantastic papers on earnings management, and I found the one by Badurcha, 2011, particularly interesting because what he was doing is that he basically said that, firms actually, there is a succession path or a pathway. They generally start with the less how should I say it, egregious forms of earnings management. So you generally start with accruals, you manipulate an accrual here and there, and your biggest concern is that once you're able to fight off your auditors, you might be able to continue. And then that kind of like segues down to the more egregious forms of earnings management. Sometimes sometimes some of them might not be within the confines of GAAP, right? Here's where you're talking about real earnings management. I'll tell you about that in another slide, right? So with this particular one, what we're looking to do is via hypothesis 3, firms that have been subject to FCPA enforcement actions will manage earnings let me read that again. Firms that have been subjected to FCPA enforcement actions will manage earnings in the year immediately post-announcement of the FCPA enforcement actions. And the model for this particular hypothesis, to test this prediction, what are we doing? We're looking at earnings management for the company. ERT plus 1 is equal to constant plus sample. So we're looking again at the sample and earnings management plus the same controls that I spoke about. Right, so hypotheses, I don't want to spend too much time on this particular slide because I have one eye on the clock. So we're also, so I'll come back to this if needed, but I want to tell you a bit about the sample and the data. So getting data on corruption is particularly, it's been particularly dicey. So here's where the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act Clearinghouse, FCPAC, comes into play, or came into play in my particular paper. Because what they do, this is a particular website that's managed by the Stanford Law School, and what they do is that they capture basically, everything that is FCPA related in terms of companies that have been, found delinquent, how much money they had to pay in terms of fines, right? And it's well maintained. I'll show you in the next slide. how it looks, the home page. So what did we do? They collected a list of FCPA non-compliant firms, sample from the content manager of the FCPAC, and we actually ended up with 124 after sanitization. Next, well, the data was merged into CompuStat in order to collect financial and accounting variables. Thereafter, earnings management variables for the period 2000 to 2020, and this is the period of the study, will be constructed using data from CompuStat. All of the continuous variables were winsorized, and total firm year observations is 310,238. All right, so this is just a visual. I won't spend too much time on this, but just giving you an idea as to how the website is run, or what one of the pages looks like, rather. And post a very simple registration process. It's extremely simple to use. So if you have an interest in this type of thing, I would suggest that you have a look when you get a chance. Right, so variables of interest. We're talking here about 3 dependent variables, first one being firm value. So we're looking at Tobin's Q, which is something that most of you will be familiar with. For each firm I at the end of fiscal year T+1 is calculated by, and this is the formula, total asset values divided by total market value. The market value of a firm, also known as market cap, is computed by multiplying a firm's outstanding shares by its current market price. So that's the first one. It's used a lot in the literature to proxy for firm value. Market to book, also used a lot. It's a second proxy for firm value, and it's for each firm I at the end of fiscal year T+1 is calculated as follows. Market value of a company's securities divided by book value. And total Q, this is a bit of a new one, came into play in 2017, coming out of a paper by Peters and Taylor. It's the third proxy. How is this different from the other two? This one actually includes intangible assets, right? So you'll see that the formula is market value divided by tangible and intangible assets. Tangible assets are assets that you can feel, you can touch. Intangible assets are assets that you cannot feel, you cannot touch. So here is where you're talking about, the intellectual capacities of people, who are actually, I don't know if I have time to give an example, so maybe I'll come back to it at the back end once time permits. But you're talking here about the assets that you cannot feel, you cannot touch, and do not find themselves on the balance sheet, right? So Peters and Taylor, they're saying that, look, for you to come up with a holistic or a very good measure of total Q, you need to take the intangible assets into consideration, right? Which is what they have done with that particular variable. Variables of interest continued, so we're also looking at liquidity. Liquidity is a proxy, liquidity one is a proxy for liquidity, which refers to the ability of the firm to settle its financial obligations as they become due. This one is measured by the current ratio. The current ratio is used a lot in the accounting literature. Very simple to calculate. Total current assets divided by total current liabilities. These can be sourced very easily from the statement of financial position. I'm sorry, the balance sheet, as it's called on the GAAP. Liquidity 2. It's another proxy for liquidity measured by the quick ratio. How is this different? With the quick ratio, you're deducting inventory from your numerator. So it's current assets minus inventory. The thinking here is that inventory is considered the least liquid current asset. So, if you want to get a real quick snapshot of as to what liquidity is, this is a very good measure. The rule of thumb here is, if you're like 1 to 1, it's relatively solid. Liquidity 3. This is proxied, another proxy. Cash ratio is another proxy for liquidity. For each firm I at the end of fiscal year T, the cash ratio is computed as follows. Cash plus short-term investments divided by current liabilities. Again, you should notice that the denominator for all three would be current liabilities, right? And the last one, in terms of dependent variables, so we've touched on firm value, we've touched on liquidity. We're also looking at earnings management. Right, so we have 3 proxies for firm value, 3 for liquidity, and we have 8 for earnings management. So I'll talk you through how we arrive at these proxies. Right, so EM1 to 8. I'll start with EM1. So this is utilized to proxy for earnings management and measures discretionary accruals utilized by a firm I at a year T+1, utilizing the modified Jones model, which is a very popular model for earnings management. And the citations here: Di Chow, 1995 et al., Kutari et al., 2005. So very simple. Well, it appears complicated, and maybe some parts of it is, but essentially what you're looking at via step 1 is to utilize the total accruals, and you are regressing that against, you have your constant, you have your first coefficient, then you have the 1 divided by total assets. This is lagged total assets, plus again your change in revenue divided by your lagged total assets, plus with your third coefficient, you're looking at PPE, property, plant, and equipment, divided again by total assets. With step 2, the coefficients that you would have obtained from step 1, those are plugged in to this particular equation, and that enables you to calculate the normal accruals. So these are actual accruals, and you can derive this from the financial statements. Step 2, you're looking at normal accruals, which is what you're calculating. And via step 3, you're looking at the discretionary accruals, which is simply the output from step 1, and you're deducting the step 2, right? So EM1 is AAC, right? We include a constant in regression as step 1 to mitigate heteroscedasticity issues. EM2, you're looking at the absolute value of EM1. EM3, you're not including the constant, and EM4 is the absolute value of EM3. Just take it to the other slide. Right, so via earnings management, again, you're looking at 2 additional proxies. You're looking at EM5, EM6. These are performance adjusted. So using AAC data from EM1, we match each firm year observation with a match firm from the same 2-digit SIC code and year, and the closest performance. This is proxied by ROA, return on assets, net income divided by total assets. EM6 is the absolute value of EM5. EM7, this is the one that deals with unsustainable sales. You know, companies are wanting to, maybe use less onerous discount credit arrangements. Maybe your terms are 30 days, so you say no, don't let us go 30. Let's go 10, right? So how is this calculated? It's very similar to variable EM1 to 4. You first calculate using cash flow information that you get from the financial statements. You calculate the coefficients, and then via step 2, you calculate using the coefficients that you would have derived in step 1. You calculate a normal cash flow, and then that is deducted. So the output again from 1 and 2, that gives you EM7. EM8 is the absolute value of EM7. Moving on to the control variables. So time will not permit me to go through them line and verse, but we're looking at firm size, profitability, big N, which is a proxy for audit quality. ICD, again, a proxy for internal control deficiencies, mergers and acquisitions, accruals. The Orfandal-Hirschman index, which is a measure of market concentration, ranges from 0 to 1. Dividend yield, we're also looking at the impact that this will have on firm value. Again, these were inserted here premised on a review of the earlier literature, as them having an impact on the dependent variables that we've chosen. Additional analyses to be included. Companies basically self-select themselves into the sample. So we need to test for that. We need to control for sample selection issues. So we're going to utilize the Heckman 2-stage model. Sample size is small, and I've got to say that which is a very credible journal. They actually utilize a sample size of 108, and their period was substantially less. If I remember well, I think it might have been for 16 years. We're using a larger sample size. We're doing 124, and we're also doing a longer period. But nevertheless, concerns will remain pertaining to sample size. So we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to do a difference in difference model to test the FCPA financial penalty impact. The panel XTGLS model, this is also going to be used because OLS has some limitations, so we're going to control for autocorrelation and heteroscedasticity. And the Hausman test, we're going to test for fixed and random effects. Robustness test, we want this paper to hold water, right? So propensity score matching, this is going to be utilized. We're going to remove extreme events, financial crises, pandemic, because we're straddling 2000 to 2020. Subsample analysis, we are going to use similarly unrelated regressions, but perhaps disaggregate the sample via the Z-score. Alternative proxies, for example, litigation risk M-score. Remove finance and utility sectors. These have different regulations, and there's always the possibility of including additional control variables. So, for example, corporate governance. Contribution, like I said earlier, we haven't seen any empirical attention that visited specifically the impact FCPA enforcement action can have on firm value, one. Secondly, we haven't seen any scholarly work that tests the moderating impact FCPA enforcement actions can have on the positive relationship between liquidity and firm value. And lastly, third contribution, the researchers have not seen any empiricism that tests the impact FCPA enforcement actions can have on firms' participation in earnings management in the year immediately after the enforcement actions. Implications, Paper will equip shareholders with the knowledge of the impact of FCPA fines and concomitantly press firms' directorate for adherence to higher levels of corporate governance. Moreover, the research can be utilized by firms themselves to ascertain the longer-term impact of FCPA enforcement actions on firm value. Implicitly in enforcement action, what it does is that it spotlights or gives some negative visibility. Shortfalls in firms' checks and balances and indicates area for possible improvement by managers. Additionally, the negative visibility that accrues to firms post announcement of FCPA enforcement actions can also be detrimental. In the year immediately after the FCPA enforcement action, auditors and regulators will need to exercise additional due diligence as firms may endeavor to obscure the unpleasant reality in their accounting reports. So what I have next, and maybe I should ask Dr. Wang, do you think I should proceed with this, or does time allow me to proceed with the additional walkthrough?
Just 1 minute so you can present all your changes.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Right, so like I said earlier, we have already run the data. So there's some sample, some descriptive statistics that we've actually derived already, right? So you will see that we're talking 2000 to 2020. You'll know that there's a high concentration of cases from just about 2010 to 2020. There was a paper I saw that suggests that, post SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley, that might have been a contributory factor. With respect to this slide, what I'm looking to do here is more or less to give you an indication as to the different industries, these firms that are recalcitrant, which industries do they come from. You will see that, business equipment, computers, and software, for example, you had 22 cases. Healthcare, medical equipment, and drug, you had 23 cases. Relatively widespread, different jurisdictions. So this is not confined to one particular country. So it's spread across, like my earlier slide suggests. But this particular slide, I'm also showing, the amounts, and I think it's useful that you have a quick look at the amounts that we're talking about in terms of bribery. A maximum amount of 1.6 billion. So again, you're not talking peanuts here. We've also run statistics for the firm heuristics variables, and we've also done for the control variables, and we've also done the correlations, right? So time may not permit me to walk through them, like I said, line and verse, but nevertheless, I hope that I've, over the last half an hour or so, sufficiently informed you on this proposal. I generally don't have a tradition for being brief, so I'm struggling with this, but nevertheless, like I said, I hope that I've given you sufficient information on this paper. So thank you so much. And I hand you back over to Dr. Wang.
Thank you, Brian. You did a good job. So this is a long proposal, more than 90 pages. And so I hate to interrupt him when he was almost done to the methodology. So good job, Brian. So let's start the committee member to ask a question. So let's start from the co-chair, Dr. Olmos.
Brian, I really enjoyed this presentation. It's obvious that you worked hard. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
okay.
I can.
Okay, good. And I just really enjoyed it. And this is one of the best proposal defenses I've seen here at JU. So congratulations on your hard work, and Dr. Wang too, of course. And in the interest of full disclosure, although I'm a co-chair, I think my input was limited to the earnings management dependent variable. So I want to make that clear. This is a great proposal defense. So I'm really pleased. Just kind of a nit. I was thinking about your sample period was from, I think, if I recall, 2000 to 2020, and I was maybe going to suggest that you maybe could, do a robustness test for, the effects, or take out the pandemic year of 2020. But I see you've got that here already, and I like it. I'm trying to think of some constructive criticism. One possible suggestion is that something I have run across sometimes is that you've got a Tobin's Q dependent variable for the firm value. That's great. Your control variable, I think, is market value of equity. I'm assuming you're logging that. And sometimes that, although it's only a control variable, since the equity, the market value is a component of Tobin's Q, and you've got a size control for market value of equity, it may mess your results up when you're looking at the variables of interest. If that doesn't occur, that's okay. The point of my comment is that there are alternative size proxies that you can use if that somehow is, I'm not a statistician, so I don't know how to put this in statistics word, but alternative size proxies might include the log of the assets, and also maybe sales. So those are just a couple of size proxies, because I see that this market value of equity that you're controlling for, which is probably the most widely used. Sometimes when there's Tobin's Q on the left-hand side of the equation, I don't know. So anyway, that's the only thing I could think of. I love the paper. I guess I don't know what to make of it. So it looks like we've got 124 FCPA fines or violations that are occurring over this 20-year period, right? And so I don't know about that. It's a great sample, though. I love that, but you're going to use propensity score matching, so that's not a. It seems like most of those occur in the recent years, and so anyway, I don't know what I'm trying to say. It doesn't seem like that's very many over 20 years to me, and so it does seem like most of those have occurred. You had a nice slide in your descriptive statistics, and my recollection is that most of those seem to occur after Sarbanes-Oxley. Like in the early years, there weren't very many at all. So maybe you don't need those years. Maybe you don't. I don't know. Maybe you don't need those years. See how most of them are taking place in beginning, I don't know, around 2007. Anyway, I don't know. So anyway, so those are my comments. The main thing is it's a great presentation. Thank you so much for your hard work, and I'm looking forward to your dissertation defense soon. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Dr. Gomez. Maybe I should make the point that when we got the data from the FCPA, we actually started with 458 companies, right? But then that needed to be merged with CompuStat data.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So as a result of the merging, before we could have merged, we needed to have the global company key, the GVK key. Not all of the companies that we got from the FCPA actually had that. So right away, we were starting a bit on the back foot there. But after the sanitization, we ended up with the 124. But I hear your comments, Dr. Lucas, and I think they definitely will be taken into consideration.
So I know you're going to do this. But whenever you're describing your sample, make sure you really describe just what you just said, how you got that, because that really lends credibility. When you've got a small sample size, you need to really, we started with 420, but and so we lost it here. So you're really able to describe how you got that number. So I'm done now.
Thank you.
Great job, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Boland. Dr. Boland, yes.
Brian, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Dr. Boland.
Well, I'm going to keep this really short because I don't want to add anything to the long list that Daphne has made for you in making this a very special presentation and a very special thesis. I think you did a great job. My comment is that I'm looking forward to seeing the results that you're going to get for liquidity and especially for the value of cash. I've been working with a number of other students looking at the intrinsic value of cash, and that appears to be changing over time, as we can see from the Apple balance sheet and things like that. So I think it's a very interesting topic or area in itself, much less the other, what is it, about 75 areas that Daphne has you working on. So so good luck with it, and I can't wait to see the next level and especially some of the results. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Boylan. Thank you so much.
Dr. Tano.
Hi, Brian. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Dr. No.
Yes. I want to echo Daphne and Bob to commend you on great presentations. I like how you highlight all of the paper motivations and how it's special, it will contribute significantly to the existing literature. I also like how you have different regression specification that you intend to do in order to improve the quality of the empirical analysis. And I like that you have quite a lot of the preliminary results to support your hypothesis. I just have one minor suggestion.
Sure.
Right now, you control for the headquarters of the firm, but this is something that you can try. It doesn't take much time to do this. Instead of using the headquarters, you can get the corruption index constructed by the Department of Justice for each of the county, for each of the jurisdictions. So you can identify the jurisdictions of the company by using their headquarters, and then use the corruption index, which is exactly the number of convictions of officials in public government agency. And this data is available on the Department of Justice, because I would guess if a firm is located in an environment where there's high corruption, then the firm might follow that practice just to stay survive in that environment. Yeah, that's all for me. I'm looking forward to see the result.
Thank you, Dr. No. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So what corruption, what Transparency International also do is that they have a corruption perceptions index per jurisdiction, right? So I will definitely discuss that. Yeah, I will discuss that with Dr. Wang and also yourself and the other committee members, and we can see how we can, possibly incorporate that. But thank you so much, Dr. No.
Yeah. This is just minor. You don't have to do this. I'm just saying this just for the sake of having something to say.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tano. So let's open the floor to the faculty and students. So is there a faculty want to ask question? Dr. Mattia and Dr. Saxon?
I don't have any questions, but I do want to just comment. I did it in the chat already that it's great work, Brian. You've done a really good job. I think you and Dr. Wang have put a lot of work into this. So I'm looking forward to see your defense as well.
Thank you, Dr. Mattia. Thank you so much.
Okay. Any other questions from the faculty and students? Okay. So we try to save more time at the end, but since everybody's a question, I'm not really sure. Okay, so probably we can finish earlier. So thank you for all of you to join this defense. So if you could, you can log off. So only the committee member will stay here. And Brian, I will email you, and when we have the decision, I'll call you back. Thank you for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you guys for attending. Thank you, Dr. Wang.
Bye, Brian.